Hi, welcome to Saturday Night at the Movies, the podcast that celebrates classic cult and current films and the people that made them and many other aspects of pop culture. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer is Ben Shrewsbury, and our signature theme was composed by Greg Lehrhoff. Here it's always Saturday night, and our mission is to chronicle film and pop cultural history one memory at a time. Tonight we're visited by director, second unit director, assistant director, and visual effects maestro Bruce Hunt, whose 2005 supernatural thriller, The Cave, is a roller coaster ride into underwater cave terror. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Steve. Pleasure to be here. Lovely.
So you're calling in from New Zealand. What was the name of the movie you're currently working on?
So I'm currently working on a movie by Patrick Hughes, the director of Expendables 3, Red Hill, and he's a friend of mine from way back in our commercial directing days back in Australia. And he also directed Hitman's Bodyguard, and now he's decided to write and direct his own feature, and it's called War Machine, and it's with Netflix Lionsgate, and it stars Alan Richardson. And this is a little bit of a genre film, and he's got a great cast, and we shot in Australia, and now we're currently shooting in New Zealand with some great action sequences.
Are you shooting anywhere near those Lord of the Rings locations?
Always, every time you turn a corner, you find another helicopter shot that was used in Lord of the Rings, and you have to go, we don't want to see that. We want to be gritty and we want to be down to earth and all that sort of stuff. But yes, it's very hard to avoid. You really, if you point the camera the right way in New Zealand, you're going to come away with some spectacular scenery, spectacular weather. So we've had literally, it's November, and we're talking, it still snows and sleets, which is very late in the season, and we're working on a river sequence, which has been very exciting. The river's surging and responding to the weather by about 2 meters. So it makes our stunts and our planning and choreography really risky. So it's quite, yesterday we were able to pull off a stunt that we didn't think we could achieve. So we're going for it in a in-camera, thrill ride, if you like. And that's cast and stunt members and crew members included. It's quite the adventure.
How would you compare the movie to a film like Road Warrior?
Oh, look, I think Pat is and I are both genre fans. Road Warrior we're talking Road Warrior and the original Mad Max having that original sense of grit and in-camera, visceral kind of nature. That's definitely what we're harking back to. Films like John McTiernan, Tony Scott, filmmakers like that is what really appeals. That Ridley Scott, of course, that whole idea that you can shoot and get that sense of being really engaged and using landscapes as part of the grit and storytelling. So Predator, other films which are you really feel you're in a foreign landscape that's very much one of the obstacles for the story is always been, I suppose, part of the appeal. You're not constrained in a studio. You're actually out there in the elements, and you embrace that, and the actors embrace that, and it makes it, staging scenes on mountaintops in snow-capped, things when the weather may change adds a certain tension to everything. So
Well,
it
I
helps.
remember I did a lot of research into World War II movies when I was younger, and I did a book called Combat Films. And I remember doing a lot of research into the making of the bridge on the River Kwai.
Exactly. Yeah.
David Lean really made use of the location in that it was Ceylon, then obviously it's Sri Lanka now, but you
Yeah.
you really felt every inch of that movie, you felt the jungle and you felt the visceral feeling of it. So I hear what you're getting at. Let's go
Yeah.
back in time. Let's talk about your youth. Were you exposed to the filmmaking world early, or was any family involved in it at all?
No, I actually my dad I was born in the USA actually, so my dad was traveling and studied it overseas, but he was in mining and oil companies, and then changed to importing luggage and leather goods back to Australia, which I think was a very clever ploy to travel every year to Italy, because he'd been to Rome in the Olympics in 1960, and he decided that Italy was the place. So the idea was that every year they could travel back, my mum and him, to Italy and buy leather goods and see it more of Italy. So we got exposed. I'm very lucky in that we got exposed to travel very early on. Australians tend to do that. We do tend to travel everywhere. Everything's distant. So yeah, we settled in Australia when I was about 4 years old, and I grew up in Sydney. And I think I was just always fascinated by everything from we got a lot of English television, things like Thunderbirds, Space 1999, UFO, those TV series, and everything American. So of course I was brought up on a diet of fantastic kind of things. But I got to say that the thing that really twigged me to the idea that you could actually, and I was an artist, I was really good at drawing, probably would have ended up an illustrator, but I found a magazine it was in Liberties in London when I was on a trip, and I was about 13, and I saw this magazine, and it was the making of Star Wars, and it had a photograph of Joe Johnston and the ILM technicians making X-Wing starfighters for Star Wars. And right in the front window display was R2-D2 and C-3PO because they just made that film that year. So this was around 77. And so I had seen that film and I just went, you can get paid to do this. It was incredible. I'd grown up with model making. I'd grown up with blowing up stuff to replicate explosions that I'd seen on Thunderbird. So I was famous for setting fire to kind of cardboard oil rigs and sending them out into the harbour as fireworks displays on our sort of fireworks night, if you like. I'd collect them all
By
and
the
make
way, in Australia, what is fireworks night? Like we have July 4th. What do you have?
Well, we used to have Guy Fawkes Night, which was related to the English kind of celebration, but they've banned it all now. So you can't have fun with fireworks because too many people were losing their eyes. So
All
so
right.
now it's but that was I became fascinated by the reality you could get from miniatures. So definitely that was a big thing, and I built myself a sand crawler when I was 13 out of cardboard and plastic, and I still have
A
it.
Jawa sand crawler.
Hmm.
I can't
So
tell you how many times I've seen Star Wars. I mean, it's kind of like a ritual to watch it every year. And uh,
yeah.
considering 1977 technology, Lucas did pretty damn well.
Oh, it was off the Richter. But I think what really struck me was that convincing reality of it all. The artistry of science fiction covers being used. We've seen all these fantastical things, but they were very airbrushed. So I really appreciated that kind of gritty reality that they got with the art direction. I believed that Sandcrawler because it was shot in Tunisia. I believed the beautiful sets in everywhere because it sort of harked back to some of the reality that Stanley Kubrick achieved in 2001. So I think it was just a lovely voyage of discovery as a young kid that was fascinated by anything that wasn't contemporary. It was another world. Everything was another world, and you got to design that world. And I think I really enjoyed drawing comics and drawing, and designing spaceships and all that sort of stuff. And I found that idea that you could take those drawings and then turn them into convincing realities, no matter what the story, and take those characters off world was really great. So that's what got me stuck in kind of that kind of genre of filmmaking, I think.
It sounds like you started your career working in commercials.
Yeah, so in Australia, the only genre films that were being made were Road Warrior. That was George Miller was a real outlier in that way, and really everything else was more domestic dramas and much more, they would be writer, actor, directed things. I mean, Peter Weir was the other sort of filmmaker that I really, everybody loved, but it really was not like they were investing in things that had the technology of visual effects to achieve, like Star Wars. So I went to art school. I came out of art school after about 4 years, and I had a portfolio, but it was it was heading towards being an illustrator. I was introduced by an art director in commercials to at an advertising agency to a guy who was a Yugoslav animator, and uh, he had an animation studio in Sydney, which was famous for doing very high end, you know, 2D animated commercials. And he had come out of Yugoslavia at the end of the sort of when the Russian invasion, and had set up shop in Australia. And then he'd also combined with a guy who was interested in writing computer animation. So it was really at the same time that Pixar was starting in the US. There was a company called XYZap, which is where I started, and they were looking for a storyboard artist. And I wandered in with my little portfolio one afternoon as a 21-year-old kid, and they looked at my portfolio, and I had done some drawings because I was fascinated by Tron, and what Steven Lisberger had done with that design and the aesthetic of that film. And I thought, I'm gonna replicate these in my portfolio, and maybe someone will like them. Sure enough, these guys just light bulbs went off, and I got the job that afternoon to start drawing storyboards. And we were using the same technology in Australia that they were using for Tron. They had, they would have a little software group that were writing code. They would come up with designs and build them, and then it would take about 3 hours before they'd turn around to me and say, "Do you like that?" And I go, "What about up a bit, left a bit, change the color of that?" And then they would go back and write more code. And so it was really this is back in '85. So this is the starting of computer graphics to be part of title making or TV titles or commercials or openings for films. So yeah, it was a very exciting time.
So
And down
when you mentioned Tron, you're talking about the original Disney Tron.
the original 1982 Tron, yeah,
Right,
exactly.
right. Of course, of course.
So so back in those days, what you were doing were you were using the computer to make because the computer was only outputting non-color outputs at that point. You were using film graphics to kind of color that with filtration and exposure and stuff. So I kind of learned very quickly. It was like going to film school. We learned very quickly to use motion control, combine it with computer graphics, shoot miniatures, all that sort of stuff. So I had a sort of great introduction to filmmaking techniques. And every time anybody got kind of there was a slightly boring commercial, we'd just challenge ourselves, and we would say, well, what about if we did it this way? And we would look up, Cinefex or Cinefantastique articles and go, well, this is how they did it there. Let's try that. And so we were really mimicking what was happening, or echoing, if you like, what was happening in the States. So these guys were putting in little short films at exactly the same time that Pixar was doing their very first forays into computer animation. These guys were doing it in Australia. So it was a fun time to kind of learn filmmaking and all those sort of techniques. And very quickly I realized that it's okay to be the guy picking the colors and being the art director, but you really want to be in charge of the story as well. So that's upstairs. There was a live action stage, and I realized those guys seem to have a lot of fun because they're doing everything.
Now,
So I
now taking the step to become a director is something that either can happen or it never happens. It's sometimes it feels like lightning has struck in a bottle. The Cave, which I saw recently, as I mentioned, I just blew me away in terms of its intensity. How did your involvement with that all start?
so I had this background in commercials, and it was really through having done being the technical problem solver, if you like. It was really that idea that you could change, you know, I had been so well versed in all those things, nothing you could almost guarantee you were trying to guarantee a result with something that people hadn't necessarily seen before. So look, I had become a bit stale, and I had become a bit looking for other opportunities. So I reached out to Andrew Mason, who was the producer of a film called Dark City in Sydney. And he and Alex Proyas, who had just done The Crow, were making a film called Dark City. And I said, "Do you need any help?" And he said, "Yes, come and shoot some miniatures for us for about 2 weeks, and then we'll see what happens." So I went there. Andrew and Alex were deep in their post on their film, and they had some more money, and they gave me a studio full of miniature guys, and we shot miniature cityscapes, that was great. And I was introduced to some really lovely team. And Patrick Totopoulos had actually designed Dark City with another Australian production designer. But the sense of being on a feature film really struck me as being able to evolve the world and push the world forward with every shot and every setup. Every day you're on set, new ideas would continue to grow and evolve. So as a director, I said, this is it. You have to be on this long journey. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So I really enjoyed that experience. And then Alex and Andrew kept me on for 5 months. So I ended up shooting 5 months on that film. Joel Silver was looking for a place to make The Matrix, and he contacted Andrew and the post companies that had done Dark City, and he said, "We need to make this film. We want to make it in Australia because we can see the value you got out of Dark City being made in Sydney for quite a small budget. It looks incredible. How do we get that?" And Andrew Mason was clever enough to say, "Well, if you employ the same team essentially and bring, your wire team from China, bring your, key talent, but essentially let us look after everything else, we can achieve it." And he and Barry Osborne, the producer, were able to come down and made The Matrix. So I was lucky enough to go on to being second unit director on The Matrix, which was a fantastic experience working for the Wachowskis. And after we were finishing The Matrix, I went back to commercials. I was happily having children at the time and thinking a nice, quiet domestic family life would be good. And Andrew kept persisting with this idea that he had this script called The Cave. And The Cave is, a horror film, but we thought, well, maybe we can, bring those adventure aspects further forward. And so we met with Lakeshore and Screen Gems, and they pretty much gave us the go ahead. So it was off to the races, and we took a lot of our crew that we had worked with on those previous adventures, and we took them to Romania to make the film.
Now, when you see The Cave, and I'll fill in some of the blanks for the listeners and viewers who don't know the film and should catch it on streaming as soon as possible. Um, it doesn't look like a little film. I mean, it's claustrophobic, yes, but it looks like you have big physical pieces going on, and I know how difficult it is to shoot them. Would you say though that the budget was fairly lower than than big studio movies?
Oh, totally. I think the budget was, for us, the advantage was having Screen Gems to distribute the film and Lakeshore. But I think it was definitely more like a Dark City budget than a Matrix budget at that point. It was so part of the reason to maximize that was to go to Eastern Europe. So we looked at Bucharest, Berlin, and Budapest, and we ended up in Bucharest in Romania. But that plays into the reality of the story. Tegan and Michael Steinberg, the screenwriters, had actually just part of the reason they'd written the script was because they'd found the original mythology comes from Romania, where we had the idea that cave entrances were blocked because demons came out and stole your animals at night, etc. They would build churches in the entrances to caves to protect the townspeople. So there was also another twist in the fact that when Chernobyl happened, and much of Eastern Europe was polluted by radiation, they found that the only waterways that weren't affected were in Romania, in the Carpathian Mountains, and that there was waterways that were completely cut off. They were able to liken it to being on Mars. This area underground was so isolated that nothing could get through to the animals and the creatures within this space down under the earth. So that was something pretty interesting to Andrew and I. Also, there was an original beat in the story, which unfortunately got taken out, which was, what if bad people went into the cave and emerged even worse? What happened in the story was that we originally had Nazis being trapped in that opening sequence in the cave, and so it would have added an extra layer to it, we felt, but there was some producer backlash on putting Nazis at the start of the
It's so
film.
funny though. It reminds me of an incident, a true story of apparently at a supply center on the border of Poland and Germany at the very end of the war, there was an explosion in a German base, and 5 or 6 men were thrown into the sub basement of this supply center, and two of them emerged 6 years later.
Wow,
That
fantastic.
Unfortunately, they only lasted about a half hour. They both died of heart attacks. Apparently, their beards were down to their toes. They were completely blind,
Oh
and they
my
had
God.
survived all those years because it was a supply center, a lot of wine, and
Yeah,
obviously some food. But they made a very bad Peter Sellers movie in the 70s, kind of dramatizing it. I don't think they were inspired at all. But
yeah,
caves have always fascinated me. I mean, going all the way back to 1959 and seeing Journey to the Center of the Earth with Pat Boone and James Mason, and
yes.
going into the Mammoth Caves of Kentucky where they
Hmm.
filmed a lot of that. It was just really creepy. And then movies lately, The Descent, obviously, those movies have become very popular. Now, was there to get the directing gig for you? Did you have to go through some hurdles, or were you the favored guy right from the start?
Look, I got to say that, I'm very lucky to have worked on The Matrix because, of course, that changed everything. It changed a lot of people's lives. So Andrew and I were able to get on board very quickly. It was his baby that he had taken to Lakeshore, and so they they went on board. At that time, the studio had just made Underworld with a sort of untried director, and that had at a similar sort of budget, and that worked out very well for them. They obviously went on. Len Wiseman had made that for a very small budget I think he made that in Budapest at a similar time,
Oh, is that the
and
same Len Wiseman who goes on to direct Die Hard 4?
exactly.
Oh,
So Len was a young filmmaker who had come from an art direction background, but he came up with that Underworld story, and he made it was profitable within the first couple of weekends for them. So they were basically Lakeshore, and it's always about timing. This is the thing. So Lakeshore and Screen Gems wanted to repeat that, and so they said, well, this seems like a no-brainer. Let's make it. Of course, it's not girls in black leather and latex and werewolves, but let's
well,
go and make a monster adventure movie.
looking at the logistics involved in making your movie, I mean, this is it, it sounds rather nightmarish, figuratively and literally.
Yes.
It's now I will show some pictures for the viewers who are watching this on YouTube because I've got some nice behind the scenes shots. But um, talk a little bit about what your first challenges were. You decide you're going to shoot in Romania. Obviously, there's studios there in Bucharest. What are
Yeah.
your challenges in terms of the water effects? Because obviously, for those of you who don't know the cave, it's basically about a group of I guess you could call them kind of, well, they're kind of adventurers, but they have bits of archaeology background as well. And
Yes.
so they're investigating a cave system in Eastern Europe. I think this takes place in current, but it starts with a prequel at the beginning, which is Cold War, right?
That's right, exactly. So I think, the first challenge that we found was we were trying to be true to the the sort of concepts of it's really the same as mountain climbing. These guys are wanting to go to places that people haven't gone before. The technology that allows cave divers to do this underwater is rebreather technology, where you're recirculating your air. This means that you're scrubbing the carbon dioxide out of your oxygen tanks and allowing it to extend. It's not fresh air, it's now recirculated. This is all controlled by a monitor on your wrist, which is run by two AA batteries. Now, there are all sorts of risks, let alone the bumping and getting stuck. There's also the idea that you may mentally not be aware of what's happening in your system. You might have a mix that's got too much nitrogen or CO2, and you start to hallucinate and you start to lose your bearings, and then you get stuck. And this is all real. And we were lucky enough to work with a dive team that had done this for real. And the moment we contacted them and we said, well, is this achievable? And they'd worked on National Geographic documentaries and stuff. But it was a cave diver called Wes Skiles and Jill Hyneth they were both extraordinary humans. And Jill is around, but Wes is not, unfortunately. But Wes is actually part of the inspiration for the story too, because his story of being trapped in a cave in the middle of the Australian Nullarbor, there's a cave system where a whole lot of cave divers, in the echo of our story, got trapped. And then Wes was the guy that actually was able to lead them out of that cave and find another route back. That became James Cameron actually made a film later after our movie, which was called Sanctum, which is also based on that same story. So it's quite interesting. Anyway, we were lucky enough to have Wes. We went to Florida, met with Wes and his team. We talked about rebreathers and the realities, and we said we want you to essentially take on the underwater component for us. You become, and we'll dress it up. We'll give you stuff that looks a little more zhoosh, but essentially it's your guys doubling for our actors in. And
What was the
Wes
word? What was the word you just used? Looks a little bit.
looked a bit zooshier, looked a bit swish. Make it more. Sorry, it's an Australian slang, but
For a minute, I thought you said it looked a little Jewish.
no, zoosh it up, bling it up. But
Um,
but no, we ended up like taking those guys to Romania. They came with us. We had to build some tanks. We had to build something and underwater sets for them to swim through, which meant all sorts of obstacles, digging tanks in minus 14 degrees in Romania.
so
But
when they're underwater, excuse me, when they're underwater in this movie, they're
yeah.
not really in a real cave system. They're on things you built.
No. The money, if you like, is spent in the Yucatan. So they did go to some of the most beautiful underwater cave systems in the Yucatan on the coast there. And you have a mixture of freshwater and saltwater. So we have both basically, and that again is part of it. It's like, well, we have to do this for real. Like there's no getting around it. You can't fake the beauty of these cave systems. The one you've got there is one of the caves that we built in Romania with a tank in it.
Extraordinary, extraordinary. I mean, the
Yes,
detail in these caves is beyond it's just the craftsmanship was crazy.
yeah, it is. Look, that's all down to our Italian art department team. So these sets were designed and built by Pier Luigi Basile, who was the production designer on Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven, Black Hawk Down, and they worked we brought them in almost as a squad from Cinecittà in Rome, and they had worked on Cold Mountain in the year before our film. So we knew that the Italians had they the interesting thing is that the Romanian language is closer to Italian than it is to Eastern European. So the beauty was that they were Italian speaking and they would employ Romanians and they were all speaking the same language. So it was a very good. They didn't like the Italians didn't like the food though, but so we had to bring in the food from Italy as well. But apart from that, it was terrific. But no, what you're seeing there is some of the that is our biggest soundstage. We went to Romania and we said, this is fantastic. We love these sound stages, but do you have anything bigger? And they said, we can build it for you. And we said, how big do you want it? And we said, twice as big as what you have. So we ended up building this thing, which is called the BFS, which is the big effing set. And it is still in use today. It's been used by Tim Burton for his Adam's Family show recently and a whole lot of commercials. But essentially, it was enormous. So we wanted the height because we wanted to have these epic spaces. And then we wanted tanks in there so that we could carry water and these guys could dive in and out of this scenario. So that was a large undertaking. But it meant that we had a lot of flexibility in shooting different spaces, and it became, and of course, the finale of the film takes place there as well.
Bruce, did you take your cast to Yucatan or was that all doubles?
That was all doubles. So we shot with all the cast. All the cast got wet. Everybody was underwater. They were all up for it, which was terrific. They all embraced it. They all did training. They all swam for real. And we put them in the water also off the coast of Romania for an opening sequence. But yeah, basically the majority was done by doubles. And my second unit director, Gary Phillips, who was also my second unit DP, went to the Yucatan and worked with Wes to coordinate that stuff. I was trapped in an edit room at that point, and I really think now, if I were looking back, I would have gone to the Yucatan because it was absolutely stunning. What those guys managed to achieve and capture was just spectacular. So
Let's talk a little
it's all
bit
down to
about
them.
let's talk a little bit about the cast. You've got Cole Hauser playing Jack
Yep.
McAllister. Now, U.S. audiences now know Cole from Yellowstone.
Hmm.
And of course, it's so funny. My friend Steve Mitchell is doing a documentary about his dad, Wings Hauser.
Yeah, lovely.
Going to be a film
Fantastic.
all about wings pretty soon. But Cole is play. It's interesting because when we see Cole on Yellowstone, he has a full beard and mustache. So this is
Hmm.
a very different look for Cole. Any particular reason you picked him?
Look, I think we wanted somebody who had that strength. I think there was, you wanted you have a group that you have to differentiate. I mean, we did try to make sure that we had distinct characters because once you get into a wetsuit, once you get into darker environments, hey, we got to make some very different looking choices. It helps. So, but I think Cole, obviously, because of his background and because of he has a maturity and a leadership quality and an intensity that works really well without overplaying it. He didn't really want to become the monster, of course, as no one does, but it worked for the film to let him and his younger brother have this slight tension. Who gets the girl? Who gets to do this? Who gets to name it? You can believe that. So I really liked, working with him on it. He embraced all the physicality. I think everybody was stunned by how, even if you're in a studio environment, um, the most bizarre thing happens when you're in a stage that's built like a cave. It means there's no flat surfaces anywhere. The water is still water. The rocks are still rocks. The smoke and the darkness, it becomes quite affecting after being and so if you're in the real mountains or the set, you essentially become the same. It's the same challenge for both crew and cast and everybody. It's quite an interesting test. It's different to shooting against a blue screen or being
Sure.
in a nice domestic drama where you can walk away. There's not a level surface, so your ankles and knees and everything becomes you're trying to stay upright most of the time. I know it's quite strange to say, but you try to use that when you build a set like that. You're trying to keep it believable, so that's part of the challenge. Anyway,
So let's see. We got. I'm just trying to pull up.
so we
Well,
had Eddie Cyprian. Oh, Lena, yeah,
yeah. Lena Headey. Uh,
yeah,
obviously, everyone knows her from Game of Thrones. You got her pre-Thrones, and
that's right.
she's quite different. She plays Dr. Jennings.
Yes.
And what was it like getting a woman to play this kind of role?
Oh, look, I think I was a bit. My experiences in these films is I didn't want to make it too male dominated, but Lena was already written as a woman, and Sigourney Weaver's essentially the greatest action movie hero, of all time for me. But I think Lena we wanted to put the audience right in her shoes. So it's really through her eyes. She's watching the brothers do this stuff, and she's trying to remain the voice of sanity in this environment, and add some technicality. But we really, she was great. Again, same thing, just embraced the whole thing. I think she'd been in Terry Gilliam's um, Cabinet film. Sorry, not Cabinet. What was it? She'd been in Eastern Europe on a Terry Gilliam film for quite a while, so she was up for this kind of adventure,
Sure,
and
sure.
she loved it.
Let me find Eddie Cibrian. Okay, there's Eddie
There
playing
he
his
is.
brother, Tyler, and
Yep,
he has definitely your basic hero looks and feeling.
no question. A good-looking fellow. So he was our action movie star. Obviously, we threw him through every obstacle we possibly could. He and Lena had to carry the back half of the film, if you like. I really like working with Eddie. The sort of positivity and enthusiasm for it was great, and I think that's part of the beauty of working with real. It's very hard to be an actor and put on a turn, if you like, when you've got the real guys sitting across from you, dressed, ready to go as your double, as your dive team. And so it becomes a slightly competitive workplace where these guys would be able to always reach out to the dive team and say, "How would I do this? Would you do this? How does it feel to do that?" It was literally like having your own, kind of crib session on the set.
Sure.
Um, yeah, so it helped the guys immensely.
And I believe, isn't that Piper? Is that Piper Parabo?
Yeah, Piper. So Piper was one of the roles which was originally written as a male, and I changed it because I felt like we needed to have someone who was, again, a younger climber, eager, enthusiastic, overly ambitious, if you like. But Piper was fantastic. So we put her through a grueling sequence. This sort of sequence evolved as they do. I really liked the adventure sort of and climbing stuff that we'd seen in previous sort of things like Cliffhanger and Vertical Limit and stuff like that. And I thought, well, look, there's an opportunity inside, even though we're in a dark claustrophobic cave sequence. Why don't we get some of that verticality, that serious, danger in a dark environment from the heights? And so that was part of the reason for, staging this in a canyon and forcing the creature to kind of show itself in a different way that we hadn't seen. Because otherwise, the concern is that you end up with something that's claustrophobic, and the whole movie becomes claustrophobic, and there's only so many times you can stage the action that way. So this was a chance to try to change it up, and there was a sequence. This sequence particularly, unfortunately, Piper got to say a line which got cut to a PG rated version, which is really unfortunate.
Was it an expletive?
Yes, exactly. You can say it one time in a PG rated film, and unfortunately they made us change it in the final release. But also there was a slightly more gory version of this, because she does get attacked by the monster, who has very long claws, and
Right.
she had a longer fight sequence with that. Yeah.
Speaking of the monsters
Yes.
in this movie are quite quite scary.
Yes.
Uh, talk a little, if you could, about the evolution of creating these monsters.
Well, look, I'm not going to be shy about it. Alien is one of my favorite films. Um, we were lucky enough to work with Patrick Tatopoulos. So Patrick had done Pitch Black, obviously Godzilla. He'd also designed Dark City for Alex Proyas in lots of conceptual ways. And Patrick and I got on like a house on fire. I was introduced to him by Andrew. We went to his place. We started talking about the design of this creature, and the idea of the creature essentially is that you've adapted. Evolution has advanced within the cave system. You will Other senses become more important. So eyesight becomes less important. Sense of smell becomes important. Communicating via sound, moving around the cave, skin color disappears. So if a human ends up, even even small shell creatures or other spiders, etc., have been found to have lose all their pigment and lose their eyesight and adapt to inside caves. So we kind of use that as a jumping off point for the creature. But of course, we all wanted to also get a little mythological. So that's where the wings come in. This is at times is it a bat? At times is it something that's able to crawl and invert and hang like a bat? So look, it's a multi-purpose thing. Trying to please all of those the wish list, if you like. I think, of course, if evolution did it, you wouldn't end up with this. You'd end up with something more like, the Descent. The Descent, I think, is a great example of a cave creature that has, similar hallmarks, and it was made slightly after us, and we were actually unaware of it at the time. It was interesting that two films about caves came out at a similar time, but we were completely oblivious to it at that point. But after I saw that film, I thought, no, that's a really great take on it,
Well, your creature is
design.
very effective. It looks like there's a lot of live action creature in
Oh
camera
yeah.
creature, but is there also some CG creature as well?
Yeah, we had, you've always got limitations. We had a guy Brian Steele was our creature, a man in the suit who was very patient. He's got massive extensions on his forearms to be able to walk. He's used to being hung up or slung upside down, etc. But yeah, the idea was that Patrick built quite a lot of animatronic heads and standalone sort of suits that we could use. Some were adapted for walking in water, some were adapted for walking on land, other ones for adapted for hanging upside down. But the trick is, of course, once it starts to move, you have to move with some pace. So we went to Luma Effects, and they created some of the creatures at the end of the film, where we got this really nimble idea of a nimble creature able to hang from stalactites or stalagmites. I can't never remember. But the idea is that they're poised and waiting above you. And again, it's kind of trying to use that vertical spaces. So I really like that idea that they could exist in a space that the humans couldn't. So they were on the roof. They could use the roof as their playground, and then that gave them a vantage point where they could either spear you or dive on you, and that sort of stuff. So we used a mixture of both. Sometimes we'd be as simple as turning the camera upside down and running across the floor and inverting the lighting. And other times it's more complicated, computer animated creatures.
I don't want to give out any spoilers because I'm sure a bunch of people will be interested in savoring this movie, having not seen it. There is a bit of a controversy about the ending.
Yes.
I want to give away too much, but it's left very open at the end with a certain uh, kind kind of a propulsive moment that
Mm.
wonder what's going on. Was that intentional?
Oh, totally. I think everybody was up for it. I mean, it's Eddie and Lena are obviously attracted to each other. Um, you want to see where their relationship goes. Um, but I think no, there's always the opportunity to leave it open for a sequel. So that was what we did. I think it's a fun that's part of the fun of making these sorts of films. It's a great um, just the same as Ash being a robot in Alien. I love those various things are going on within. So we're not quite sure how it gets into your bloodstream, what's in the waterways, etc. It's classic, you know.
Having made that film, do you have any desire to do your own cave exploring underwater?
Never. I'm not that stupid.
You and me both.
Look, it's just incredible the bravery of these guys. I mean, I do, you know, the beauty of making these things is that you get to go to some amazing places and work with some incredible people. But cave diving is particularly hard. The idea that these guys would go through spaces where they would take their tanks off and push the tanks ahead of them. So your tank is no longer on your body, it's ahead of you. And if you get stuck and it goes through and you're not with it, you're going to end up in the dark. It's quite terrifying. And, look, I think
The expletive that comes to mind, I know which one it is. You are effed.
no,
But
it's crazy.
these rebreathing tanks, I got the impression, give you, is it unlimited oxygen? How does that work?
It, it's just recirculating and scrubbing. It's a filtration system, an active filtration system that takes the CO2 out. It needs a mix, but to do that, you're still adding other gases. So but they have done, I think at the point we were doing the film, and don't quote me, but I think it was around the longest was 24 hours, but I think longer dives have been done because, of course, you you're traveling into a cave system, you're going to the furthest point, it branches in multiple directions. You have to allow yourself the time to return with something up your sleeve. So it's all about that timing. It's the same as a full tank of gas, you got to be able to get the return journey. They will also stage it. They will leave tanks on the way and be able to pick those up or have other divers with new tanks. That's, of course, but there's so few divers that, it's a risk and reward. I see the attraction, but everybody knows the risks. It's obviously the technology's advanced since then, but it's still as physical as going to a place that you have not seen and potentially no other human has seen. It's a little different to going to the top of, uh, Everest, where it's a well-traveled route. These guys are still finding places that, have not been seen. So look, I think, that was part of the appeal from the get-go. It was that, oh, well, this is a story that hasn't been seen. I think Cave for me that was a big part of the appeal because I must admit I'm not as interested in the horror aspects but I was definitely interested in the creating a challenging world and seeing something that we hadn't seen before. So,
Well,
look,
for my
yeah.
money, the movie has a compelling propulsiveness that
Oh,
keeps it
good.
moving. There's no dull spots in the cave, and I'm
Yeah.
surprised you didn't direct right after that. Did you have projects you wanted to get going in the typical Hollywood two-step?
Oh, look, it was yeah, I think at that point I felt like I can't remember the timing of it exactly, but at that point it was quite a tough project to pull off. We transferred from Australia. We finished in LA. Um, and I think I just wanted a quiet life for a moment. I had been asked to go and work on Matrix 2 and 3 by the Wachowskis, and I'd turned that down. So I sort of wanted to make more films. I think the lesson for a young director is that and essentially coming from commercial making, where you have a lot of authorship. In Australia you do, and England you do, but maybe not in America. But as a filmmaker, I found myself a little bit um, railroaded by the studio, and that's not being rude. It's just part of the realities. The line is always, well, how many features have you directed? So Screen Gems will take hold as the distributor, because they're going to put it in 2,500 screens and say, this is how we want the movie to feel. This is how we want the tone of it. And at the very last minute, they turned it from an R-rated, what would have been an R-rated film, into a PG-13 rated film, which, as you know, makes a big difference to the tone of the film and the dialogue and all that stuff. So I felt a little constrained on the things which you would normally, as a director, feel freedom. So we felt Andrew and I came away with a feeling of, let's reconvene and try and do it on our own terms. I think, I'm planning to make some films, and Patrick and I have been talking about some other projects that he's got in the pipeline. So we'll see. But I think as a young director, I think this was my first feature, and my advice to a young director, in that same position, is make sure it's with a subject that and have some control over that project, because once you've made it, that it can, we found that we were not listened to as well as we could have been in the writing and the editing of the film. So I think if it had been an R-rated film and we'd been allowed to use some of the actors' improvs a bit more and not stick as so closely to the original script, I think we would have had a better film. But you never know.
It's interesting because today, with the level of violence and
Mm,
rawness and grit in movies, particularly in action pictures,
mm.
it's so funny because my wife isn't really much of an action picture fan, but whenever she sits down and I'm watching something and it's a real heavy R, I can
Yeah,
see her wincing every 2 minutes. Uh,
yeah.
and it's just, it's like there's nothing left to the imagination anymore. The blood and in fact, I remember, I think it was last year, I went to see All Quiet on the Western Front, the German,
Oh yeah, yeah.
which I
Amazing.
nicknamed Mud and Blood. And
Exactly.
just I think it would have I don't think they would have changed it to a PG if it was done today.
Yeah. Look,
Oh,
I think there's always, for a director, there's only one first film. So if you're going to put it out there and you're going to put yourself, a year or 2 years of your life into that feature, you may as well you want to make sure that you've got a level of control over that project. So if it's a smaller project, that would be my advice. Do something that's smaller and controllable. That at least you can say, that's my voice, that's my film. Whereas I think with The Cave, as beautiful as it is, and the craftsmanship, I'm very proud of all the things we achieved and what we managed to bring to the screen. I wouldn't say it's not a personal work. Some of my commercials, for example, would be more personal. Some of my where you're able to have that control all the way through to the post and the edit. The most important part of it is the storytelling, and if it's all about taste. My taste is different to the producer or the distributor's taste. That's it. End of story. If you can get your taste and your voice on the screen, that's why you want to make films.
I also want to not put a nod to your two composers, Reinhold and Johnny. I thought
Yes,
they did a nice job with the music, which often is very critical in movies like this.
exactly. No, they're amazing. So they had done Run Lola Run, and again Andrew had introduced us, and we got on like a house on fire. They were just so enthusiastic from the get-go. They would give me tracks to start editing with, which were just simple beats and rhythms, rather than being composing. So we weren't waiting and we weren't temping the score. We were using their tracks. Again, we started out with a slightly different bent on it, because Reinhold had come from Rammstein, and Johnny is a genius, and so their take on it was a little bit more it was almost like you were mixing sound design because we loved the shapes and the sounds that you could get within a closed environment like that. So I was very lucky in having great um, water effects guys who had done sound designers who had done The Matrix and Revolutions and Resurrections and stuff as the sound designers, but we were kind of blending that with the music. Again, the studio kind of interference meant I want to go back to a more classical score. So they had to turn about 90 degrees a little bit late in the production to embrace a bit more classic horror and orchestra, whereas we had a slightly more contemporary vibe. But it was still, they're both super effective. For me, I wish I've still got some of the tracks from our original temping, and it gave a lot of shape to the spaces because again, we were all really concerned that the sound of the film would become repetitive, and we wanted to allow silence and water dripping to play, so you really felt the texture of a space, and not wall-to-wall music, sort of. And the guys, Johnny and Reinhold, were fully behind that. They just wanted to bring it in when necessary. So I think we would have ended up with something a little more minimalist in a way, but it works very well. They were still
I
very
remember
great.
interviewing John Barry
Mm,
about Thunderball, and when he
yeah.
designed the score for Thunderball, he said that one of the things he discovered is that when you're shooting underwater, you can't make the music too fast. If you
Yes.
go too fast, it doesn't work underwater because there's things slow down a little bit. So his music score for Thunderball is
Mm,
very slow and atmospheric.
exactly. Yeah, that was our key word at the time. They used to get bored of me telling them that, but it was definitely. Yeah, we were watching The Revenant the other day for this film I'm working on now. And if you listen to that film where you've got the landscape and snow, crunching gravel, the sound of water over rocks in the rapids, the wind, all those things, and that's what reminds the audience of the spaces they're in and it surrounds them. And we played with the echoes as well, obviously, in the way that people shout or the sounds that you could hear from the creatures and how they would echo through the spaces. And that's a huge part of this film in setting that um, and and trying to address the filmmaker's fear that it all looks like it's on a stage. They'll never believe it. So you're trying to add that credibility. So it was like dial it up to 11,
Oh,
layers and layers of water dripping.
I never believed you're on a stage. I felt
Oh,
I was
that's good.
totally in that cave. Absolutely.
Well,
Well,
that's
we have
great.
we have been talking to Bruce Hunt all the way in New Zealand, where he's working on a new film, uh, War Machine. War Machine, I think.
War
Yeah,
Machine.
War Machine. Absolutely. We look forward to seeing that. You've been watching and hopefully listening to Stephen J. Rubin's Saturday Night at the Movies. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer's Ben Shrewsbury, and I've been told that I am not promoting our other podcast enough, so please tune in to Tales from Hollywoodland, which I co-host with two wonderful producers, Arthur Friedman and Julian Schlossberg. One of our upcoming podcasts is going to be on great underrated movies, which I think is interesting. Certainly, this one would qualify. The Cave is definitely
Hmm.
very underrated. And Bruce, thank you definitely for coming, and I hope to have you back again, maybe when your next film comes out.
Exactly. I'm available. Thank you, Steve. That's fantastic.
Fabulous. See you soon, everybody.
See you.